An example would be when you have like a German person and their sort of views on maybe makeup. Well, Europeans in general. Generally, European wear, but especially German folks, they wear much less makeup than Americans. And those who wear lots of makeups there in Europe are generally identified with prostitution. And because of this, sometimes European brothers are going to tend to look at American Christian women as identifying with sort of, a pretty unholy profession. And likewise, we as American brothers tend to look at, people having a beer or something in the afternoon. We tend to look at that as like a really, really bad. We look at German people as drunkards or someone who is not sincere about their Christian walk. Now, there's nothing wrong with wearing makeup or not wearing makeup. And there's nothing wrong with drinking a little bit, but you have to really be careful about both of those things, especially the drinking. But the overall point is let's not be like Saul and favor the traditions of men. Let's make sure that we stand firm in the true gospel and not necessarily get caught up with all sorts of goofy winds of doctrine and what other people tend to put on you as holy or not holy or anything like that. Chris?
Yeah, he says he profited in the Jews' religion above many equals in my own nation. Now, this is pretty interesting. Now, Paul, it was kind of a Renaissance man. He was a Pharisee taught by Gamaliel. Gamaliel was known to be probably one of the most premier Jewish thinkers of that time. Would you have any information about him?
Well, there is a little bit. Off the top of my head, he came from the school, I believe, of Hillel. Right before the time of Jesus, there were two guys who got there. They sort of identified the two schools of rabbinic thought. There were Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai, and they were sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum. And Gamaliel, I think, came out of Hillel's school, but I believe that he was. The interesting thing is that I may have which school he came out of wrong, but everybody respected him regardless of which school you came out of. If you were of Hillel's school, you just respected Gamaliel. If you were Shammai's school, you still respected Gamaliel. The other thing is, as you mentioned, he of course taught Paul. We actually have found some letters of Gamaliel's that we believe are authentic. And when I say we, I just mean archaeologists in general. And I'm not an archaeologist, so the we is sort of in the broadest global sense.
Yeah, you weren't on that dig.
No, I wasn't out there brushing dust off anything. But they found some letters from Gamaliel that actually mentions Paul and says that the biggest problem was finding him books to read, finding him information to read because he was such a voracious reader. He was reading all the time. Really, he was much more than a Renaissance man. He would be viewed as sort of a cross between, a modern statesman and a theologian and a leader, and a sort of a businessman, and just all of these things, almost sort of like rock star status, preferred status in all things, in his own tradition there.
Right. And we see in other places Paul appealing to his Roman citizenship. He obviously, as we see later, he to spread the gospel message, he would essentially be whatever he needed to be, and not in any compromising way, but he would conform to whatever he needed to in order to reach as many people as he could. Mm-hmm. You read about Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5, and also in Acts 22, verse 3, it talks a little bit more about that situation. Now, I'm going to read a quick, again, from Martin Luther, who did some really great commentary on the book of Galatians here. He says this about Paul being more exceedingly zealous of the traditions of his fathers. He says, did God call me on account, speaking of Paul, did God call me on account of my holy life or on account of my Pharisaical religion? Or this might be his own testimony. Or on account of my prayers, fastings, and works? Never. Well then, it is certain God did not call me on account of my blasphemies, persecutions, oppressions. What prompted him to call me? His grace alone. And that's all I have on verse 14.
It's interesting you mentioned we're talking about the traditions of men. The word here the word here in verse 14 that I translated as profited, and it's probably translated other places. Really, that's a pretty poor translation. It means to drive forward. That is to figuratively advance greatly, to grow in time, or to be well along. So really, this really speaks to like how zealously that word prokopto, it really speaks to just like how driven he was. That's it implies a very strong driving forward of doing.
Very good.
Yeah. 15 and 16. But when he who had set me apart before I was born, and who called me by his grace, man, that's cool, was pleased to reveal his Son to me, in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone. So we see here Paul reflecting on an important principle, and one that has been getting some debate among sincere Christian brothers on both sides of the fence. And it's the idea of being set apart. Paul was obviously referring to being set apart for the preaching of the gospel, but there is an equally interesting idea of being set apart from the world system, of stepping away from sort of the Babylon idea of men pleasing and the subtle pressure against the boundary of what is truly important. And I notice this in my life a lot. Chris?
Yeah, a few different things. He says here, but when it pleased God, which is basically he's saying that he did not come to Jesus because any man decided he should, but it was when it pleased God. Additionally, God did not choose Paul because there was something in Paul that pleased him, and we can tell that because he was actually on his way to go kill Christians when he was met. So there wasn't anything necessarily that was going on that he did and deserved it. He says, "Who separated me from my mother's womb?" And here we see that God's hand was on Paul from birth, and I would submit that that is true of all of us, and that God has a plan for each of us. And I would say to everyone out there to discover what that is, and I would also suggest that some of us sort of spend our whole lives waiting for God to start a ministry for us.
Just go do it.
Right. Exactly. I mean, that's what my suggestion would be, just to...
Don't wait around.
Just to do what he's revealed all this stuff in his word. You have definite things in his word that say, feed the poor, give to the orphans and the widows, these kinds of things that you could say, this is direct revelation from God. I know that he wants me to do this. I know that he wants me to make disciples of all men and all these sorts of things. We all have different gifts in the body. You might not be an evangelist or teacher, but maybe you're an exhortation or helps or whatever it may be. But just start to do for him and let him then begin to prune you. It says in John 15, verse 2, every branch in me that does not bear fruit he taketh away, and every branch that bears fruit he prunes it that it may bear more fruit. So if you think about that, I mean, if you just start to bear fruit, just what he wants to do, just start doing that. Don't wait for him to throw you through an open door. Just start, and he'll take care of the rest.
Yeah. Yeah. What else is interesting is reading this verse, this idea of being set apart before he was born. It's also interesting because to the reader who is familiar with the Old Testament, this sort of harkens back to Jeremiah. And in some ways, you want to talk about somebody who just went out there and did it. Everybody was stoning Jeremiah and saying, no! And Jeremiah was saying, yes! But, the idea here that he's talking about, this whole idea of being, we can see Paul's missional ideals similar to Jeremiah, and that he was sort of largely ignored by his fellow Hebrews out there, and, when he went out there to preach to the Gentiles. Paul is sort of aligning himself with Jeremiah in that end, but with a twist. There's this name change and the concurrent change who's bringing the gospel. It's very interesting. While you were talking, I was looking at Jeremiah, and Jeremiah 24, 6 and 7 came up. And since we've been talking about, grace and the renewed life, I thought that was especially important to share. For I will set mine eyes upon them for good, and I will bring them again to this land. And I will build them and not put them down, and I will plant them and not pluck them up. And I will give them a heart to know me, that I am the Lord, and they shall be my people, and I will be their God, for they shall return unto me with their whole heart.